Hello everyone, today we talk about the meeting point of common law and the so-called Iura Propria, right, the local laws of the various communities through the interpretation of the juridical science in the High Middle Ages. So we have started this series about medieval law, observing fundamentally how the rediscovery, especially of Roman law during the High Middle Ages, proper since the 11th century in a structural way, the Bolognese school. And we can say about, however, the world juridical science, as Roman law was properly a content, not an actor in here, committed itself to frame, in fact, this rich multiplicity of enforced existing law, right, that was in force on the territory. Also juridical sources, systems, etc., within the legitimizing categories that were disciplined, in fact, by the libri legalis, that were essentially how Roman law had been codified in this phase, by the Bolognese tradition. So this is, first of all, important. We already made videos about this. There is a playlist specifically dedicated to it, so if you get lost, you can go back there and see how the Gloxerists and the Bolognese school actually emerged, and why it's so important, what actually and why Roman law was triggered, right? Emerged, what triggered the emergence of Roman law in this period. It has very deep causes, right? Socioeconomical, political, institutional, right? The great revival of European economy in this, since the High Middle Ages, the struggle, the important theoretical struggle, properly at a juridical, legal level of between the papacy and empire, right? And therefore, what we see that Roman law really does is actually not just being recovered, but also being used to frame the other particular systems at the local level, and this happened also in another ground. For example, the Canon collections, right? So the papacy and the empire were, in secular and religious terms, were actually carrying out a bit the same thing, applied. Roman law emerged mostly at secular level and was kind of more important at some point, especially at the beginning. But canon law, as we will see, will have also its own time, even in areas that frankly emancipated themselves before others from the church, right? And the terms of such operation are debated by juridical historiography, and the natural point of view of such a debate is mostly caused by the thesis was formulated, let's say, at the beginning of the 20th century, according to which this broader juridical reflection had brought, allegedly, but it's not true, to actually a unitary ideal of medieval law, right? That, in this sense, was seen as if it had read in an homogeneous and systematic way the plurality of sources and of norms, and the unifying element of such plurality was constituted, according to this thesis, by the Holy Roman Empire de facto, as the theoretically the most powerful secular authority, and surely at least endowed such authoritativeness properly, that was conceived naturally, even at the time, heir of the one of antiquity, right? This has nothing to do with what reality actually was, or whether there's a huge debate. As a matter of fact, I discussed what the Renovatio Imperii was at a political institutional level, and we can't say brutally that just either the Holy Roman Empire was the former Roman Empire, was not, right? It was something in the middle that actually had, and this balanced view is actually very important to get, because otherwise you couldn't even explain a phenomenon such as the revival of Roman law, right? If it hadn't been a Holy Roman Empire, right? If objectively Roman law would have had a much lesser importance over time, right? At least in this broader ideological sense that did exist, but was actually not shared by the majority, but not even properly conceived as such, at least for what concerns the legal practice. So according to this old vision, especially the Bolognese, the Italian juridical doctrine had theorized, such as law proper of the medieval empire that was in force in all the regions of the Seine, which is already a tricky point in terms of territorial jurisdiction and actual authority, right? However, the Roman Justinian Theodosian law, whatever you want to call it, and had basically elaborated an innovative reading that had rendered it useful for the discipline of contemporary society, and that had basically sided, as we were saying before, by the canon law, right, of the church, that was naturally competing at a juridical level on with Roman law proper, right, in different terms that today we will not discuss because we will have to deal with canon law also. But that had definitely many intersections, because of course the thing happened in parallel, by the way, and as we've seen before, even for the struggle of investors, so where these were the two main protagonists of the clash. So two universal laws that corresponded basically to the double-faced nature of the medieval empire, that was tendentially universal, but practically different in the sense that it didn't actually encompass in terms of imperium proper, right? The world Christianity, were these two laws that, albeit having each one their own specific context of application, the Roman one competent for the secular matters, while the Canon one for the spiritual ones, were between each other basically indissolubly tied, as we were saying before, such as were these two authorities in the empire in many ways, right? The empire and papacy fought, but this has nothing to do with their actual reciprocal recognition. They were just contestating the fitness of those who rose to the top of their respective systems, but not criticizing. Also criticizing the prerogatives of one system over the other, especially the empire in terms. Well, actually both of them, but they were still supporting each other, which is often deeply overlooked. But this is also another complicated story we'll have to tell someone else. So, a symbiosis of the two universal laws basically allowed to fill some gaps in either one or the other, right? So this is interesting because, of course, they were even sharing certain actual institutions, right? But the systems were different. So Roman and canonic law in the this creative interpretation of the doctrine constituted, in such sense, the utrumque ius, right? That is the let's say the law common to all the peoples of the empire, right? So a law that was tied to the charismatic authority of the vertex of the empire. The emperor, the papacy, was credited to have undebatable or undebated authority that was superior and universally recognized. But in this sense, the important here is that common law was not a unique law, right? Because the Roman law, the Roman canon law, let's say, was not the only system in force. The medieval empire, in fact, was distinguished neatly from the later developments. Here we are in the Middle Ages, right? There is no such thing like a centralized state, but especially, what will emerge from a juridical point of view since the beginning of the 19th century with the Code Napoleon in the French Empire, that basically created the state as the sole source of law. So this state had eliminated the traditional particular systems that had therefore abolished every institutional separation between the citizens and itself. On the contrary, the medieval empire, was substantiated by the multiplicity of systems and of particular realities of its own regions. Right? The Roman Empire had, let's stick to the Middle Ages for now, but the Roman Empire naturally had a much greater authority, right, in a central sense. Of course, the empire was actually a sum of communities, were regulated in a different way, but of course, the Holy Roman Empire was not as centralized as the empire had been, And actually here it passes all through the feudalization of power, the ban on lordships, and all these things. But let's say that, to make a long story short, at this point in history, by the 11th to 12th century, the empire was fundamentally justified in its authority by the effectiveness that it actually, through which it actually ruled over the territory. This is very important because it's a very important thing that even in the Roman religious principle actually had an importance, right? The Roman state had eventually transformed itself in a kind of legalistic system, right? A true centralized state, for those time standards at least. The Holy Roman Empire was not, but in a way was still drawing its own, legitimacy and authority from the effectiveness of itself, right? Whether, if it was not effective, the other communities felt free to say this is not the empire chosen by God, because they can't even basically protect Christianity. And so it was. These different systems were known as the Iura Propria, right? And with them, the emperor had defined precise relations, right? And according to this older theory, the relation between the Roman, common Roman canonic law and the Iura Propria was expressed in an orderly hierarchy of sources, right? That actually never existed, right? And the criterion would have been that basically from the smaller system, there was a sort of ladder that led directly to the universal empire. So this is not completely devoid of truth in ideal principles, right? That was what the empire was meant to be, right? In force of not just a pre-existing law, but actually the capacity of ruling, which is a different thing. According to this vision, the lawyers that were active in a commune, let's say, of central northern Italy, that were very autonomous on their own, and technically under what the Germans had, managed to keep loosely together since Ottonian times, used to resolve the problems that were underposed to them by, for example, initially employing the norms of the city statutes, right? And where these would have not disciplined the case that was disciplined, they could be, they could, turn to the customs that were enforced in the territory in which the commune was found, and if it was not even here, and they would have not found the adept norm, they should have at that point recalled to common law, right? While the judges of the guilds, before taking exams, the communal statute had to research the norm of the corporative statute, and from their own side, the judges active in a city of southern Italy, for example, that belonged to the Kingdom of Sicily, so something that technically, and this was debated at the time, but it was not the control of the Holy Roman Empire before, but was still ideally under it from at least, the Ghibelline point of view. They, before passing to the norms of common law, they had to verify the existence of a royal law that had, the nature of general discipline for all the inhabitants of the kingdom. So there is a sort of, you understand the autonomy that stands within this principle of local communities, right? It had to be free in the true common law spirit, and if something could not be resolved, then the king could express himself. And I made the example of Sicily because, as we already explained in that video on the Constitutio Puritatem by Frederick II, or of whatever, whichever lawyer court, actually even in later times after Frederick promulgated, there was a sort of capacity, even local, of the king in that case, to actually create a new law, which actually didn't happen in the rest of Europe, right? Not even kingdoms actually function like that, and that is an exception, in fact. And at that point, you can imagine even how the Holy Roman Empire was detached from this, right? because this empire existed by name, but in practice, it was just this series of German principalities were quarreling among each other, and every once in a while, a leader emerged as an elected one, by the way, and tried to accomplish this broader universal unification. But at that point, the main deal was actually how approved he was by the local communities in this sense, and not much of how much law he could do. Right? And when they tried to do that, things also went fairly, alone, things went fairly badly, right? So this is the point, right? That this older thesis had definitely, from one side, a positive aspect. It was the capacity to present law in the Middle Ages as a sort of your organic unity, and therefore to assign to it this nature of system that the let's say prevalent methodological address tendency in the within the European juridical studies starting from the last decades of the 19th century, and was defined in particular by the Panbaptistic school that basically attributed to the Roman law and to every sector in which it had been articulated its positive law. This in both, it could be either civil, penal, procedural, public, etc., and that considered, let's say, an indispensable condition in order to recognize an authentic scientific nature to doctrine that interpreted every one of these partitions of the juridical system. So certainly this was a different system compared to the one elaborated for the Roman law and also for the law in force, right? That were systems of norms that were tied among each other by logical rational relation, because the system of medieval law had to do especially with the relation between the sources, not much between the norms, right? So for the aforementioned reasons, because every community brought his own law that they had created by themselves, and that eventually, had the precedence over the rest from their own perspective. Then, of course, from the centralizing perspective, what the empire tried to do, this was another thing. And however, it was, let's say, a system that allowed, a theory that allowed a kind of, unitary and, this older theory, about the unity and the rationality of, the multiplicity, if you want. And that, in this pattern, also allowed to recognize also to that this is the real point for why these ideas emerged, because, the fact that the medieval law, right, had essentially a sort of scientifical, praisable value, right? That there was something unitary after all, even if there was no central state at the time. This was the main concern of those who were trying to reevaluate the Middle Ages, but on a wrong ground in this sense. So, according to this older view, the system of common law basically reflected the institutional system of the whole Roman Empire, which it repeated the double-faced, Roman canon authority and the coexistence of a local pluralism and of general unity at the same time. And from this, there was also the conviction that the same system was entered in crisis when at the beginning of the modern age, the medieval empire had begun to lose meaning, and both under the spiritual point of view, that, basically as a consequence of the breaking of the religious unity of the Western world, both from a political one, right, then the affirmation of national states. This theory also stated that the unitary system of common law had known actually a long transformation, in which it was possible to scan fundamentally three phases. Right, the first one had to do with the so-called phase of absolute common law, right? And had to do allegedly the 12th, 13th century, characterizing for the, let's say, the predominance of the common law over every other source that was in competition with it. You can already imagine how wrong this theory was, right? The second one was the period of the subsidiary common law that corresponded to the 14th and 15th century, and that saw the growing affirmation and the spread of the Iura Propria, the affirmation of the modern state fundamentally, and probably the modern state, not the contemporary one, not the national one, nation state. But therefore, I don't know, the Kingdom of France had its own long historical, juridical independence and structure and, mechanisms, and therefore that was emerging. Even the competition with the empire was ever more fragmented, right? So these are the Iura Propria, right? Something that, in this view, kind of evolved in parallel to an alleged, bottom plate of common law that had at some point been established, right, in the High Middle Ages. This is nonsense, right? But to conclude, the third phase that would have coincided with the centuries of the modern age was known as the base, would have been considered as the period of particular common law, was marked by, in every state, by the preeminence of the juridical sources of the sovereign of law, right, of the kings, right, that eventually came to become absolute, right, as a unique normative source in because it was basically emanated by the princeps, right, that was impersonating in that case the state with a capital S, and from the will of which the validity of every other source stepped, so that the common law could continue and to be observed only in virtue of a permission of the sovereign. So you understand how systematic this concept is, and the most perceptive of you have probably already realized the sense, as we were explaining it before, of what this whole thing was. It was pretending that, after all, common law had represented an absolute at some point in high medieval times that was framed within this, it existed always in parallel to the Iura Propria, but basically disciplined the whole thing as a paradigmatic point of reference to which basically everybody would have resorted, whether if there were some gaps to fill in the doctrine. And that theoretically was tied to the, to the absoluteness, in a way, to the Holy Roman Empire, at least in this sense of juridical preeminence. So such a construction has been naturally debunked, and it actually isn't surprising. It took a fair amount of time. This is something that happened most towards the end of the 20th century, if I get it right. This, went disgregating within the same cultural context, naturally, as it often happens within the previous doctrine theory had already developed, because for example, the panbaptistic system was fundamentally abandoned, and the problem of finding a positive science of law, right, also presented itself historiographically. I mean, the realization that the system had never worked as such, right? Also because, if, the power of states rises, but, are we sure that this had risen from a previous moment to which, common law had been accepted by everybody? This is not actually true. I mean, common law as properly, not the system, right? The modern system that you find in countries of Anglo-Saxon legacy, where the common law is fundamentally actually the common law of the communities that stem specifically from the English kingdom, and was in one sense yes a proper common law in England, but it was still something that wasn't shared by the rest of the medieval communities, right? So and that had other common laws. So common law in this sense, not at all as something stemming from the emperor, or homogeneous and shared. They didn't care fundamentally. They didn't need that, right? Look, in fact, at the Anglo-Saxon tradition in this sense. I mean, it always worked without. I mean, it could go differently, right? Even Britain, if the kingdom and the monarchy had prevailed over the parliament, might have done something different. We wouldn't be talking about what is an exception, because it really stems from, largely at least, from the Anglo-Saxon world and the other countries that had comparable systems. Yeah, they are important today, but they haven't spread this around because it was mostly non-colonial powers. But aside from this, there is also, and most importantly, I would say, the lack of this anxiety that existed at the beginning of the 20th century, that was evaluating the Middle Ages in a positivistic sense, to pretend there was a unitary and organic system for not just for the medieval but also for the past systems, right? And in this new cultural context, there were naturally much criticism that was done against the previous theory. There is also a contradiction in this older vision, when, for example, common law was considered a sort of spiritual thing, right? The fact that naturally we're talking about the Holy Roman Empire, and within this there was also the Church, so a concept that mostly emphasized also in idealistic perspectives, because these were theories that were also spreading countries that at that time were influenced by idealism, was enforced in virtue of a sort of religious nature, right? A sort of a legislating system driven, religiously speaking, by the idea that these institutions were sacred, and therefore deriving from the imperial sovereignty, read as substantially identical also to the one of contemporary states that kind of created internal sort of cult of the state itself, in a totalizing fashion, much more than actually the one that existed in any previous period. Also, there are other observations that have to do with the connection between the empire and common law, within the territorial vision of law, right? The consequence of presenting Roman and Canon law as necessarily enforced only on those regions that were actually under the authority of the empire, right? And if this had been the case, why, for example, did Canon law exist in countries like France or England that this is debatable, but at least acted outside of the empire, or the Holy Roman Empire, that theoretically from their side, from his side instead, was thinking that they were within it. And this is also very interesting. But it's evident that we don't quote France, recall France and England by chance, because as we've seen before, these were countries that were developing also certain particular juridical systems on their own, with a national monarchy. It was more advanced than anywhere else, especially in those exactly in those centuries in which Roman law was being revived in Italy. And I stress here even the separation of the two sides of the Alps within the Holy Roman Empire, because for all the Roman law, for all the Middle Ages, Roman law was not enforced in Germany. Right, the Holy Roman Empire was theoretically seen about this theory in this way, but actually the ones who invented it were the Italians, were the ones that actually were fighting against the centralistic push of the German monarchy, and that which in turn was not using that system, was using essentially this local this Iura Propria that had each land of Germany that had their own tradition. So what kind of absolute shared homogeneous system was this, and how common was this law? Right, evidently not much. Also, other authors have stressed that the expression of utrumque ius is to be found in medieval sources, but not to designate the symbiosis between Roman Justinian law and canon law, but just to address the course of studies that was active in many general studies, a course that basically taught just civil subjects that, together with the canon one, was concluded with a doctorate that basically was addressed not as in Iura civili et canonic, but for brevity in utroque iure, right? So this was the real concept of the thing, and therefore it was actually pretty local things after all. It was part of a system of teaching, but it was not present in other countries in different ways. There is also another element that contrasts with older theory, that is the originality and creativity of the reading that the civilists gave, had over the canonists themselves, right? The fact that the jurists, for example, had in front of them texts that were passed down since antiquity, right? That, as we were saying before, Roman law in this sense went more far, especially initially, than canon law, and that were acting on their own, right? Very often detached from the same imperial authority to use them and to frame, legitimate their reality with the one of Roman law, right? And as we have seen in other books, in other videos, without really, copying it, but just actually interpreting Roman law in a very original way. The seconds, on the contrary, had to do with texts that were born from a deep work of updating of the collected sources in a way that their commitment in order to enact them was sensibly more reduced. And yet also other authors have also doubted the possibility to recognize canon law as common as such, right? Because only Roman law probably was really attributed this common nature, while the canon law was fundamentally just limited to the church, right, and its holdings. That, as great as they weren't, essentially they weren't secular, right? The secular word was much more articulated in this sense, and it basically limited itself to define the juridical discipline that the universal church had, especially also in comparison to one of the national churches, because naturally, as you know, these began also to behave differently. That, of course, the papacy rose to an hegemonic role over Western Christendom, but it didn't control literally every single church out there, even if naturally this is a complex thing, but there were also oppositions in this sense for interests. Now we don't have to recall from both sides, right? There is also another even bitterer criticism, right, that has to do with the general concept of whatever common law was conceived like. The medieval lawyers probably didn't have any awareness to operate in a system that was ordered on the base of sources, right? From their point of view, they rather looked at the Justinian and canon texts only when they deemed them as, these lawyers, when they deemed them useful for the solution of concrete cases, and therefore they basically excluded all the other norms from those texts that appear to be surpassed, right? So in the first case, they would have passed not to the general norm because they were like thinking that, that's where they should have gone to, right? But just because they were interpreting, traditionally and spontaneously after the doctrine was what was, recognized in terms of, norms of common law nature of, the, let's say, the subsidiary and integrative character compared to the one of the special laws, right? The local laws. This is important because it makes you understand that there was also actually a transformation of the attitude towards Roman law, right? Towards the end of the Middle Ages, of course, Roman law was considered much more like common law than it was actually in the same 11th and 12th century. But when these lawyers were resuming it just because they wanted to check out another model, but not because they attributed a kind of a absolute universal value to it. This is really the point. And such observations naturally have, if not wiped out, but at least definitely made crumble a consistent part of the previous view that naturally had its own importance in general, because of course the universal powers pushed for such ideals to be enforced. Of course the Holy Roman Emperor would have liked law to be enforced everywhere according to the Roman model, in which they had uniformed everything and it would become universal law, common law, right, for everybody. But it never happened, right? Here there was no chance of doing it. And we don't have it even today, after all, right? We just have very, very strong states today, but we still live in different nation states. So there is not a common law, right? We're building, things like human rights, etc. But this is like still very weak thing. Like, it's not that human rights exists as suspended out there and that they're respected by everybody, right? The idea is that we shared it just because shared them in international policy just because our countries basically have the same human rights because of what we have developed like in the last centuries. But someone out there says no, who is gonna enforce that? There are sanctions, etc. But we're very, very far from saying, okay, we live in a common law for everybody. Actually, this is not pertaining to the size. I mean, to dominating system, the size of system. So, however, within these two positions, there are still certain interpretational problems. The first, there are fundamentally four. The first one has to do with the relations between Roman law and canon law, right? And especially the way they were disciplined. And because we don't know exactly where there was a rigid distinction between, for example, the subjects of competence, or if, for example, they were more complex and articulated and overlapping in many ways. The second point is that Roman law is often recognized as a common law, right, provided with a superior authority that was ideally indiscussable and universal. That was out there, that definitely, those who recovered Roman law had started thinking, of course, on the fact that, if this was Roman law and it was one of the Christian empire, by the way, already at that time, but of course they didn't have problem to take the pagan legacy of it, because it had been inherited by the same Christian juridical tradition. Whether this awareness really existed. This is a bit more complicated in the sense that, as we said before, it's really a matter of, from which side you stand. Like, are you from the ones that try to stress common law, actually local laws are the ones that should be safeguarded, and nobody, at least the authorities should interfere with it at least as possible. You think that there must be a stronger authority, and that so that everybody can be, disciplined equally, let's say, in a way. The third question has to do with the relation between the jus commune and the Iura Propria, right? And we don't know if this was disciplined by a precise hierarchy of sources that essentially mortified the first to a merely subsidiary role if it presented different terms. At this point, didn't recognize an immediate role and an immediate and decisive one. 4. The qualification of common attributed to Roman law, right? And more specifically, if it was like actually recognized exclusively as, with this merit of superior authority, or it was adopted also with different meanings, right? So we try to address this now briefly. So the relation between civil and canon law in reality do not seem to have been exclusively disciplined by the separation of, let's say, secular spiritual matters, as they could see, right? Certainly, canon law dealt with questions that had to do with the clergy, whether, and the, for example, the articulated system of the church, right? And that had to do with the, for example, direzione persone, or the ones relative to the matters that the church at least claimed of its own exclusive competence, like ratione materia. But its discipline didn't end here, and relatively to this, we should remember the decisive contribution of canon law to the canon science and the discipline that certain laws, of certain laws that have nothing to do with religion in this sense, from a spiritual point of view. For example, it has to do with possession, right? For the defense of which the medieval canonism defined certain original judiciary actions, and it's the case, for example, of the protection of the naked agreement, right? That the canonists wanted to basically to limit to the contractors, and the civilistic science basically ended up to get all the contributions of the canon one, and even as much as basically it was part of the latter by receiving a lot of subjects, right, that came from the civil thought. And there are certain examples that actually have sometimes not to do even with the Middle Ages, but always considering that the system basically remained similar to the medieval one throughout all the modern age, right? So it was basically the same thing. It's just that there were more centralized powers that were emerging, but fundamentally the concept was the same. The church had its own sphere of jurisdiction, etc. There is an interesting case that shows actually the deep connection between the Roman and canon law that has to do actually with a trial that occurred in Rome in the mid-17th century between the Congregation of the Holy Inquisition and a mercantile company that had basically taken in location an ironwork of the Inquisition. Had rented it, right? So after the certain events that now it was skipped, basically the company had not been able to produce, right, what was dictated in the rental contract, right? And therefore the renting company had at that point invoked the application of a clause was inserted within the same contract with the Inquisition, according to which in such a case in which something a cause of major force would have prevented to produce the annual canon, the annual canon could not be paid. So at this demand the Inquisition had answered negatively, right? And therefore they went to court, and the company was defended by a very famous jurist and lawyer, Giovan Battista De Luca. At the time was one of the most important European figures in that field, that was a guy who could contest the Inquisition, that at this time actually was not a disgustingly black legend on the Inquisition that frankly, it's an insult to the dignity of human intelligence just by knowing history of law and how it actually worked at the time outside the Inquisition. Actually, the Inquisition was a garantist institute. It was the only place where you were condemned only if there were actual proofs that you had to be condemned, that you had to have a regular process. Secular systems where just threw you in jail, killed you. It was not a great deal, right? But anyhow, basically, De Luca qualified this case as remissio mercedes and therefore passed to examine both the norms of common law that disciplined it and the reading of the same that was given by the juridical doctrine, starting from the great science of the commentarists that we discussed in other videos. And it's very interesting to look at this, that because the jurist at this point stated that he's abstained his defense, founding himself both on the canonical, the dispositions he found in the Canon collections, both on doctrine, right? But of the latter, he didn't recall much the canon opinions, but rather the theses that had been formulated by the civilists in the reading of the Justinian norms relative to the remissio mercedes. So there was an important choice of field, right? And it's there is an evident witness of the symbiosis between the two laws, right? That was definitely affirming at this time in the science of common law. And for the reception from the civilist side of the creative contributions of the canon science, it can be remembered that in the 16th century, a practical French practical jurist, Jean Imbert, in his volume Les Quatre Livres des Institutions Forenses, that was published in Lyon in 1585, presented the frame of juridical actions, of civil juridical actions specifically, to distinguish them impersonal and real, and subdividing the latter into petitory and possessory ones. So the judiciary defense of possession was an original contribution of canon science, and it had been received, therefore, fully by civilistics that had in this way managed to free itself from the ties that had actually even blocked it, in terms of, blocked it to the obsequium towards the Roman discipline, right? That where the possession was defended not much by the action but through the interdiction. It also should be remembered that there was a very creative contribution that the canon science brought to the definition of the procedural rights, right? A contribution that in fact helped in a very important way to make surviving the importance of the canon norms in the Protestant countries after the breaking with of the unique, let's say, of the Christian unity at the beginning of the modern age. And what is fascinating here is that in these Protestant countries, the canon law actually continued to be observed, right? The only exception being those subjects that actually touched faith, right? And not only for its, you see what this means. So, that the word disagreeing with the, of course, the Catholic clergy had been structured, right, and the authority of the papacy, etc. But they kept everything else because this system juridically was, very high level one. It had a very highly cultural and technical content, but also because it actually had a very well outlined procedural rules that were defined within it, right? So think about this, right? Because that's where paradoxically Roman law didn't extend. That's why we're saying the Middle Ages was actually probably more important than canon law, but during the modern age, Roman law in this Protestant country was not used but canon law was. So it was actually one of the Catholic Church that had survived within the Protestant juridical systems. Relatively second point. So, first of all, we have to remember that recently it's been, debated how Roman law would have been recognized as a common law since the time of the Glossarists. So from the 11th century. And truthfully, this was a doubt that had always existed historiographically, even in the older theory. The older theory talked for the time of the Glossarists of a absolute common law, right? But only for the subsequent era of a subsidiary common law, right? So therefore assigning to it only to the second phase the articulate hierarchy of the sources that constituted the thesis on the unity of the system of common law, right? So there was a problem in the interpretation of the actual nature of common law in its mechanism within the system. So the topic is being dealt with more than 20 years ago now. And it's been observed basically that the Glossarists never qualified actually Roman law as common law, right? And the reason being that the Glossarists didn't want to discuss the so-called omnes populi of Gaius, right? Nor that the passage from Ulpianus that was also quoted by Gaius that had qualified common law only the jus gentium, right? Omnes populi qui legibus et moribus reguntur, right? Partim suo proprio, partim communium omnium hominum jure utuntur, right? Nam quod quisque populus ipse sibi ius constituit, id ipsius proprium civitatis est vocaturque. Ius civile, quasi ius proprium ipsius civitatis, quod vero naturalis ratio inter homines constituit, id apud omnes pereque custoditur, vocaturque, ius gentium quasi quo iure omnes gentes utuntur. Right? And while for Ulpianus, they were called common laws, both the jus gentium and the jus naturale, right? The quote was jus civile est, quod neque in totum a naturali vel gentium recedit, nec per omnia ei servit, itaque quum aliquid ad dimus vel detraimus juri communi, jus proprium id est civile efficimus. So, without translating literally everything, for both the lawyers, the Roman civil law didn't have the nature of common law, right, of jus commune, right? It entered basically within the particular rights. So these other, communities were disciplined in a different way. This is very important because it makes you understand that Roman law itself actually had developed back in the day. Coexisting with a lot of other laws, right? The Roman Empire wasn't built as a centralized state from a day to another, conquering the world from a day to another, imposing the system. There were many levels of laws, right? Actually, that were recognized to other peoples, including the subjected ones, right? The Roman Empire wasn't so pervasive as we think. I mean, the Romans made working those things that were important to them. The rest, people were relatively free to do whatever that they wanted, right? If there were certain specific standards, then if things worked, if trade proceeded without problems, that was it, right? And there was no need to block the local laws, because why, right? This is a prerogative of universal empire. So according to this glossarists, they would have not, because we're not completely sure, but it's still probably a good idea, would have not discussed the thought of the two Roman jurists that we have quoted, and would have continued actually to qualify Roman law as particular law, right? Without considering it common law, right? And this idea actually was started to be bent historically in the Middle Ages only within the school of Orléans, especially by Pierre de Belperche, that actually theorized the distinction between the two forms of civil law, right? One general was constituted by the Roman law, the other special, formed by all the different statutory local laws, but only with Bartolus from Sassoferratus this theory was this idea was abandoned, right? And it was him, Bartolus would become a major figure of at the Bolognese school, and he would have had the merit of basically surpass the theory of Roman law as general proper civil law, right? To stress instead the nature of common civil law, right? And this thesis, according to which the Roman law functioned basically for everybody as a valid law, was definitely accepted within the juridical science only in the 16th century. So after the Middle Ages, when it was actually instead generalized the denomination of common law for Roman law, and were clearly outlined its relations with the local, the special laws, or the those particular laws that were proper of the local communities, right? So to substantially similar conclusions arrived also other scholars, right? There was a gradual elevation of the corpus juris civilis of Justinian to common law, right? And during the Middle Ages, it was slow, and it matured after the great spread of communal statutes, and in virtue of the judiciary and statutory practices. That is to say, that the idea of common law emerged only where the Middle Ages themselves achieved a level of juridical uniformity in certain specific powers, right? It's not a surprise that it's at the time of Bartolus and Balthus, for example, that this happened, because they were living in regional states that were beginning to uniform all the various territorial laws because of the sake of administrative homogeneity, right? So this to facilitate the government. So that's in a way a legacy of the gradual of what was transitioning into the Renaissance fundamentally. So such conclusions attribute to the idea the formulation of the idea of Roman law as common law provided with superior and universal authority to the refined juridical science that affirmed itself in central northern Italy at the end, if not in the mid, if not at the end of the 14th century, because this is the period where it happened, and they posed it in a direct relation with the extraordinary spread of the communal statutes. They were, as we were saying now, being posed as, by the way, very sophisticated juridical systems on their own, but now they were taking over even other minor ones, right? At a local level, right, with spread of seigniories and this greater power, central power. So the commentators basically matured at this point the idea, right, having, let's say, equated the idea of this statutory norms that existed in common as in the same way that the Roman civil law would have done, right, and to which they had been inspired themselves, because these were the same places where Roman law had been recovered in this sense. So relatively to the third question, so the relation between common law and the Iura Propria, right? It doesn't seem possible that the common law was just a merely subsidiary thing, right? The sources actually show a radically different relation, right? It's outlined actually that when the jurist was posed in front of a concrete case to interpret, he actually made an immediate recourse to the Roman canon law, right? It proceeded immediately, in fact, to insert the case within the abstract, elaborated theories of the doctrine on the base of this law, right? And thanks to this insertion, the case was participating to the auctoritas that was recognized to the same law, and therefore it received stability and certainty and becoming a legitimate source of laws and of duties. And the effective discipline of the case was eventually constituted by the norm of jus proprium that regulated it when it existed, from the other side by the interpretation that the doctrine starting from the gloxa had provided and continued to provide of the theoretical category. It was committed used at that point, and that of the many different individual situations that were comprised within the same category. And we will have to see better, let's say, in other videos, how the medieval juridical science was looking at, the possibility, of course, of prosecuting the work of Roman jurisprudence in giving order to the particularism, medieval particularism, framing it in theoretical and rational categories, though actually of small or middle size, that, or also in the higher one of the contracts, in order to actually offer this homogeneous reading of it and providing it with a coherent discipline, right? Let's always remember the Bolognese school actually that came to dominate the juridical studies here was always aimed at providing a practical use of law, right? The point was not ideological. That's why it actually, kind of crystallized in terms of the various commentarist authorities, but at the same time it always remained open to the idea that the thing had to work in practice. And this was very important even for answering our question, because it evidently shows that there wasn't an absolute value attached to Roman law per se, right? It was a functional way of doing the thing. And that's why also, we said it in other videos, so we don't repeat it now, but this idea was existing within the medieval jurists, right? Who were actually convinced of the fact that from Justinian law could be drawn the discipline of every juridically relevant case, also the ones that were emerged from, their own contemporary socio-economical reality, right, differently from the ancient world. So you see both sides of this thing, how they managed to accept the potential role of this system that they naturally saw as more elaborate, more complete, and that they were looking at exactly because they wanted to make things working well in practice. But as we've seen in other videos, they also came to actually interpret in a very original way, in a very adaptive way, the same Roman law. And this is particularly important, right? This is what brought to the recourse to categories formulated by the same Roman jurists, right? Because these were already read, right? And hence it's also from here that stemmed the attention to the subjective situations of the parts in a juridical relation. The definition of new theoretical categories that were created in an original way on the foundation of the Justinian and Canon texts in order to read in an orderly way the aspects of contemporary reality. And the interpretation of the Justinian and Canon texts from the side of medieval jurists, to make the long story short, was basically always tied to the resolution of a concrete cases, right? In the same way, actually, which it had happened for Roman jurisprudence. So the Roman canon law found immediate application as a consequence in the concrete life of law. Time itself to the discipline of the various particular laws, right? And therefore, the fact that the Roman canon law was immediately and directly enforced in practice found this clear confirmation in the fact that medieval universities, the objective was the training, the education of experts for the concrete life of the unforced law. The only subjects of studying were constituted by the two jurists, and no space was left to the study of the other juridical sources. And the example we made about the Inquisition and the Company, etc., is interesting also in order to clarify the relation between the common law and the particular laws, because as we have seen, that the question had to do with the application of a contract clause of rent that was concluded now between the Congregation of the Holy Inquisition and the Mercantile Company. And this clause followed the enforced norms, right? And it exonerated the lessor from the canon payment in the case that extraordinary event would have slowed down the production. So the clause that we could, it was sort of particular law, right? It was just expressed by the two parts during the contract. So both the Holy Inquisition and the Lucam, that was as we have seen, the defender, the lawyer of the Mercantile Company, framed the case in the Justinian category and also in the canonistic one at the same time. Both of them, of course, in the Remissio Mercedes, so that these were completely overlapping from a Roman and canon law. And this framing rendered basically certain and legitimate the rights and duties of the parts, right? They eventually passed to analyze the numerous situations in which the parts of the relation could find themselves, the contemplated situations by the norms of common law that were defined by the medieval and now modern doctrine. And in this frame, they read the disposition of the contractual clause taken in exam, and on the foundation of such meeting between interpretation of common law and of particular law, they formulated a proposal to actually find a solution to the cause. And therefore it appears legitimate to conclude that the common and particular law contributed both to the definition of the actual discipline of the cause, right? This is the point. It was subordinated to the same agreement in a way. Therefore, the common law recognized, for example, the immediate application because it offered certain categories and personal cases within which to frame the question that had emerged within the practice to confer to the indispensable juridical legitimization, right? And also because it participated together with the particular law to the definition of the effective discipline, right? So it was a flexible system after all, so that presents in this regard an interesting view. So it's the immediate meeting between the jus commune and the jura propria in the discipline of the case of the practice that was put in clear evidence in the 16th century in this work by Stefano Federici in the De Interpretatione Legum that was contained in the Tractatus Universi Juris, that first volume from I don't remember, I think it was in Venice 1584. And on this occasion, he indicated three different relations between the jus commune and the statutum, right? The one of the statutum secundum jus and the statutum praeter jus, and also the one contra jus, the statutum contra jus. In the first case, he dealt with a statutory norm, the discipline of which coincided with the one of norm of common law, and that therefore couldn't present any problem of conciliation between the sources, right? Nor any question rose in the second case, considering that the statutory rule enriched the, a Roman canon discipline in harmony with the same. The problems emerged in the latter hypothesis, according to which, when the statutory norm went against the one of common law, right? In this case, according to the jurist, the contrasts were resolved by making the statute prevail, right? But also, however, considering the disposition of this one as a mere exception to a common rule, right? With the consequence that on it, there couldn't be like another category could be formed and applied to in general for all the people. So this is, for all the contexts, right? So this is very important because it shows the permeability, if you want, of common law with the local, with particular law, and at the same time, however, it recognizes how the latter is still an exception compared to common law. Here we are at the end of the 16th century. So Federici here was actually making this, study very likely, basically certainly, let's say, because the common law and particular law were at the same time present within the discipline of the concrete case, right? And if the hierarchy of forces had been enforced, the presence of a statutory norm would have prevented every recourse to common law, right? And consequently, it could have not, it could have not existed a competition between the two sources. So this is very, very important, right? And because the two things were mixed, right? They were brought by the same particular law that accepted the, let's say, the due to the common law, because it had taken it itself, right? It's like a bit the previous case of the Inquisition, but in that case you see that it was the two parts that decided that the thing could be resolved in the same way. In that case there was an overlapping of the thing. Here instead was simply the concrete case in which the same particular law had come, had decided to use the common, the canon element, right? The common law element by itself, right? And therefore it had to make it work in that regard. So you understand with these, just with two examples, how original the juridical science was in terms of, continuous contributions that enriched it, right? That every subsequent generation of interpreters constituted the primary factor of the law observed in the practice. And all the general studies were active in this period. There was the creation of a sort of common culture and language, right, that the students acquired and used, and after having obtained the license or the doctorate, right, or maybe on, even in their activity of judges, lawyers, notaries, practitioners, and so on. And for these people, the interpretative logics and the theoretical categories that were elaborated by the doctrine on the base of the texts of Roman and Canon law constituted in such a way a common unitary patrimony that came to meet and to basically confront with the specific local juridical reality that was definitely characterized by the multiplicity of statutes, of customs, with which everybody had to do in practice, in everyday life. And to this law that was common and articulated appears legitimate to extend the qualification of law of the jurists, with which the Roman imperial law and has been vividly indicated as the law of law, right? The right of law, right? It was affirmed actually in the French Revolution, and through which will be, started the primacy of the juridical sources, right, of the act of empire of the sovereign state. Right, so this is important because it makes you realize that what eventually brought to the end of juridical particularism was at the same time the same common practice that had developed, right, in these pre-contemporary realities at many different levels socioeconomically. So I don't know how, whether you followed me till the end, because I don't know how much you are interested in this, but I think it's very interesting. It at least makes you understand a lot of things about the not just the times and spaces, but properly the practicalities of reality that could even match with ours, right? In a very comparable way, right? And also considering that we live in the world that has been created by this sense of commonality. Just, however, with differences in terms of which sources were employed to achieve this. So, yeah, I think we can stop it here, and we will naturally continue to deal with this history of law videos. And for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.